I was assigned to a folding chair at the very back of the ballroom at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, tucked beside the catering exit, close enough to smell the kitchen grease and hear the clatter of servers stacking plates. The rest of the room glowed. Round tables draped in ivory linen, hurricane candles, floral centerpieces my mother had spent 3 weeks selecting. 300 guests dressed in their finest, laughing, drinking, celebrating the kind of marriage that gets framed and hung above a fireplace. And me, I was at table 14, between a door that swung open every 4 minutes and a retired couple from my father's bowling league who kept asking me if I was one of the caterers. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came later, when a man I had not seen in 6 years crossed the room, stopped dead when he spotted me, and stood there with an expression I recognized instantly. Not pity, fury. The quiet, controlled kind that comes from a man who has spent 40 years in professional service and knows exactly what disrespect looks like. He pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down without being invited. He leaned close and said in a voice meant only for me, "Don't you move. I'll handle this." But I'm getting ahead of myself. My parents' anniversary gala was held at the Harborview Grand, a hotel in downtown Columbus that my father had helped build in 1998 when his construction company was just starting to become something real. He liked telling that story. He liked pointing up at the atrium ceiling and saying he knew the man who poured the concrete. Tonight, that same atrium was strung with warm Edison lights and filled with the people my parents had collected over a lifetime. City contractors, church friends, neighbors from the suburb where my brother and I grew up, and a considerable number of business associates who had benefited from my father's handshake over the years. I drove from my apartment on the east side, still carrying the particular tiredness of a 48-hour shift rotation. I'd changed out of my station clothes in the parking garage, shaking wrinkles from a dress I'd folded into my bag 3 days earlier. I stood in the elevator, smoothing the fabric, and told myself it would be fine. I told myself the same thing I had been telling myself at family events for the better part of a decade. Just show up, be present, don't expect anything. The truth was, I hadn't been sure I was even coming until 2 weeks before, when my mother called and said, with that particular gentle firmness she had perfected over the years, "Rachel, your father would really like you to be there. Not that your father misses you. Not that the family feels incomplete without you. Just that he would like you there, the same way he would like the centerpieces to be tasteful and the weather to cooperate." I said yes because I always said yes, even when yes cost me something. My name is Rachel Calloway. I am 31 years old and I am a lieutenant with the Columbus Fire Department, Station 9. I have been on the job since I was 22, worked my way up through probation, made lieutenant at 29, the youngest in my station and one of 7 women at that rank in the entire department. I have pulled people from burning buildings, administered field trauma care, made decisions in the dark, and the smoke that I will carry in my body for the rest of my life. I don't say this to brag. I say this because none of it ever seemed to make a single impression on my father. My father, Robert Calloway, built Calloway Construction from a 2-truck operation in a gravel lot into a mid-sized firm that had projects across 3 states. He was proud of that, and he had every right to be. He was a self-made man in the clearest possible sense, and he had the calluses and the long work hours and the particular brand of stubborn persistence to prove it. He was not a cruel father. He was not absent or cold in obvious ways. He showed up to school events, coached my brother's baseball team for 4 seasons, attended church every Sunday with the reliable regularity of a man who believed in structure. But he had a vision for what a family was supposed to look like, and I did not fit neatly inside it. My brother, Tyler, was 3 years older, broad-shouldered, easy laughing, the kind of young man who made adults relax the moment he walked into a room. He was good at the things my father valued: negotiating, schmoozing, reading a room, knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet in the way that made people trust you. By the time Tyler was in his late 20s, he had a seat at the table in my father's company. By 32, he was co-owner. By 35, he was running the day-to-day, while my father played the gracious elder statesman at events like this one. I was supposed to work there too. That was always the unstated assumption, the way it was never directly said but understood from every conversation, every family dinner, every offhand comment my father made about the business being built for the next generation. I tried it for one summer after high school. I did site paperwork, ran materials, learned how to read a blueprint. I was good at it. But I was also 20 and I felt something pulling at me that I couldn't name then and can only describe now as a hunger to be inside the kind of work where the stakes were immediate and real and right in front of you. When I told my father I was applying to the fire academy, he didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He sat at the kitchen table for a long moment and then said, "I suppose that's your decision to make." And then he got up and went to his study and closed the door, and that was the end of it. That quiet dismissal was somehow worse than anger. Anger would have meant it mattered. Quiet meant he had simply reclassified me as someone whose choices weren't worth the energy of a real reaction. My mother was warmer but not better. She worried about the job, about the danger, about what people would think. She asked if I was sure multiple times over multiple years, long after the question had stopped being genuine curiosity and started being a kind of low-grade disapproval she couldn't quite let go of. She came to my graduation from the academy, took a photograph, hugged me, and then spent the rest of the afternoon asking Tyler about a permit issue at one of my father's new sites. Holidays were the worst. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, the conversation orbited Tyler and the business. Projects they had landed, bids they were negotiating, clients who were happy, markets that were growing. My father sat at the head of the table and Tyler sat at his right hand, and the whole evening had the texture of a business dinner where I had somehow been invited by accident. I'd mention a difficult rescue. My father would nod and say, "Must be tough," and then pivot back to whatever Tyler had been saying. My mother would ask if I was being safe. Then they'd move on. One particular Thanksgiving stands out. I had just finished a 4-day shift during which we had responded to a warehouse fire that took the better part of 14 hours to control. 2 of my guys had been treated for smoke inhalation. I had been briefly evaluated for a shoulder injury I'd gotten pulling a door against its frame in the heat. I came to dinner exhausted, carrying that specific kind of depletion that only comes after something has demanded everything from you. Tyler had just finalized a deal on a mixed-use development project downtown and announced it during appetizers. My father reached across the table and clapped him on the shoulder. Actual, genuine pride, broad and unguarded. I watched it the way you watch something through glass. Later, helping clear dishes, my mother said in a soft voice, "Maybe when you have more seniority, you won't have to work the dangerous ones so much." As if seniority were something you built toward in order to eventually be less committed to the job. As if what I did were something to age out of rather than something I had chosen with everything I had. That was 3 years ago. I stopped expecting the glass to shatter. The night before the anniversary gala, my parents hosted a small family dinner at the house. Tyler and his wife Melissa were already there when I arrived, sitting in the living room with their 2 kids, who were 5 and 7 and already worshipped by my parents in the way that only grandchildren can be worshipped. My father was in an armchair by the window looking like a man at the height of a long happiness. My mother was moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the purposeful energy of someone who had been preparing for this week for months. I came in with wine and was greeted by a polite hello and a brief hug from my mother and a nod from my father. Tyler stood and gave me a quick, one-armed squeeze. "Glad you made it," he said, and I believed him. Tyler and I were not enemies. We were something more complicated than that. 2 people who shared a childhood and a bloodline and almost no common language for what we had each become. Dinner was the usual performance. My father talked about the gay logistics, who was coming, who he was most looking forward to seeing. Tyler talked about the new site in Dayton, a commercial retrofit he was excited about. Melissa asked my mother about the centerpiece flowers. The kids drew on the back of placemats and needed to be redirected. I ate my food and answered the questions that were occasionally aimed at me, mostly from Melissa, who was the only person at that table who remembered to ask them. At one point, my father said, "To no one in particular, I think Douglas Merritt may be coming tomorrow." He confirmed last week. I looked up. The former fire commissioner. My father glanced at me with mild surprise, as if he had briefly forgotten I might have a reason to know that name. His firm does consulting work for some of our city clients. Known him for years. I nodded. Douglas Merritt had served as Ohio's state fire marshal and then as the commissioner overseeing Columbus's entire fire and emergency services division for nearly a decade. He had retired 4 years ago. He was the kind of figure you heard about before you ever met him. His name came up in training, in departmental briefings, in the quiet reverence of older firefighters who had served under his watch. I had met him exactly once, at a commendation ceremony 2 years earlier, when he had presented a unit citation to Station 9 after a multi-alarm apartment fire on the east side. He had shaken my hand and said something specific and unhurried about my team's work that night, the kind of comment that told you he had actually read the report. I didn't say any of this at dinner. I just nodded and went back to my food. The next evening, I arrived at the Harborview Grand an hour before the gala started, changed in a lobby bathroom, and made my way to the event coordinator at the entrance to find my table assignment. She flipped through a laminated chart and ran her finger down the list. Callaway, Rachel. Table 14. I found it easily enough. It was the last numbered table in the back quadrant of the room, angled just enough toward the kitchen exit that when the doors swung open, you caught a full draft of warm air from inside. The nearest occupied tables were filled with people I didn't recognize. Distant cousins, perhaps? Or the obligatory professional acquaintances who had been invited out of courtesy. Table 14 had 6 seats. 3 were empty. The couple already seated introduced themselves as friends of my father from his bowling league. The woman immediately asked if I was part of the event staff. I told her no, just a guest, and sat down with my water glass and the particular stillness I had learned to build around myself over the years at events like this one. Around me the room filled. The front tables were bright with laughter and connection, my parents moving through them like people who had spent a lifetime gathering warmth. Tyler and Melissa were at the family table, front and center, the children luminous in their small formal clothes. My mother caught my eye once from across the room and gave me a wave that was either warm or distracted. It was impossible to tell from that distance. I thought about leaving, not the way you think about it when you are genuinely miserable, but the quiet, calculated way, measuring how early was too early, whether anyone would actually notice, whether the drive back to my apartment would feel like relief or just a different kind of loneliness. I decided to stay. Not because I expected the night to improve, but because some part of me that had been forged through years of doing hard things in bad conditions refused to retreat from something just because it hurt. Then, 20 minutes into cocktail hour, I heard my name. Lieutenant Callaway. The voice was measured, authoritative, unmistakable. I turned. Douglas Merritt was standing at the edge of my table, silver-haired, straight-backed, wearing a dark suit with the careful, understated quality of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He was looking not at me, but at the table, at the placement of my chair near the kitchen door, at the empty seats around me. His jaw shifted. "Commissioner Merritt," I said, standing out of instinct. "Old habits from the academy." He shook my hand firmly. "I thought that was you." He pulled out the chair beside me without asking permission and sat down. He looked at me steadily. "Why are you back here?" I gave him the answer I had been practicing since the night before. "I'm just glad to be here, sir." He looked at me for a long moment in the way that experienced people look at you when they know you are giving them the polished version of a harder truth. "Your father is Robert Callaway." "Yes, sir." "And he put you at table 14. I didn't answer. He looked at the kitchen door, then back at me, and his expression did the quiet, controlled thing I had noticed earlier, the fury that didn't raise its voice. "I'm sorry," I said, for no clear reason. "Don't apologize," he said. "You have nothing to apologize for." He picked up the table card with my name on it, examined it as if looking for something written between the letters, then set it back down very gently. He said, "I'd like you to catch me up on Station 9. How's the crew?" And just like that, he talked to me. Not at me, not past me, to me. He asked about the department restructuring that had happened after his retirement, about the new equipment rotation, about Captain Wynne, who had been a lieutenant under his administration. He listened to my answers the way people listen when they actually intend to remember what you say. At some point, I realized that several nearby guests had recognized him and were glancing our way with the particular social awareness of people recalibrating who at a party deserves their attention. When the room transitioned to dinner seating, Commissioner Merritt stood, buttoned his jacket and said, "Come on, we're not sitting here." "Sir, I don't want to cause a scene." "You're not causing anything." He said it with a calm so absolute it felt like a physical object. "Follow me." We walked through the room. He moved the way he had always moved in professional settings, unhurried, certain, with a quiet command that required no announcement. People stepped aside without knowing why. He located an open seat at table 4 near the front, adjacent to the elevated platform where the evening speakers would stand. He pulled out the chair. I sat. He found the name card intended for that spot. Someone who had apparently not arrived, folded it once and placed it in his jacket pocket with the casual efficiency of a man who did not second-guess himself. I was aware, with the precise spatial awareness that comes from years of reading rooms under pressure, that my father had seen this from the head table. I watched his expression shift without moving from the front, to confusion, to something harder to name. Dinner was served. The commissioner introduced me to the guests at table 4, a city planner, a former colleague of my father's from the early days, a woman who ran a nonprofit she had built from a single grant over 15 years. He introduced me by name and rank each time, and each time he added something specific. Her team responded to the Linwood warehouse fire. She made lieutenant at 29. She has been with Station 9 for 9 years. Details that could only come from someone who had paid attention, who had kept a record in his mind of the people who deserved one kept. I kept waiting for the moment to feel strange or performed, but it didn't. It felt like evidence. Evidence that the work I had done in invisible hours, in the dark and the smoke and the exhaustion of the job, had been witnessed by at least one person who had the authority to confirm it existed. My father was watching from across the room. I could feel it without looking directly at him. Tyler had noticed, too. I caught him leaning toward Melissa and saying something, their eyes drifting to our table. When the formal portion of the evening began, the MC introduced the program, a video tribute, some remarks from family friends, a toast. The commissioner leaned toward me during the video and said quietly, "I'd like to say a few words tonight, if that's all right with you." My stomach tightened. "Sir, please, this is their night. My parents. I don't want to make it uncomfortable." "I'm not going to ruin their evening," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth in it. Those are different things." I opened my mouth to protest. He said simply, "Trust me." And the particular history of how that phrase had been used by people who had earned it made me press my lips together and say nothing. The video tribute ended. Applause. A longtime family friend gave a warm, meandering toast about my parents' early years, their first apartment, a story about a broken-down car on their first date that the whole room had clearly heard before. Laughter. More applause. Then the commissioner stood. The room noticed immediately. There is something about certain people, the kind of presence that has been built through decades of showing up in genuinely difficult moments, that produces a hush before a word is spoken. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't need one. His voice was the kind of voice that filled space without effort. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, with the tone of a man who does not actually apologize for many things. "My name is Douglas Merritt. I served as fire commissioner for this city for 9 years, and before that as state fire marshal, and before that I spent 20 years in a turnout coat doing the work that still matters most to me." A ripple of recognition moved through the room. Several people straightened. "I've known Robert Calloway for some time through professional channels," he continued, "and I have enormous respect for what he has built. Tonight is a celebration of 40 years of family, of partnership, of a legacy worth honoring." He paused. "And it is for that reason that I want to make sure this room knows something about that legacy that perhaps has been overlooked." He looked across the room. He did not look at my father. He looked at me. "Lieutenant Rachel Calloway has served with the Columbus Fire Department for 9 years. She made lieutenant at 29, the youngest in her station. 2 years ago, her team responded to a structural fire at a residential complex on Linwood Avenue. The building had 12 occupied units, faulty wiring in the substructure, and 2 residents who were unable to self-evacuate. Lieutenant Calloway made the call on the ground that night that kept her team from a floor collapse that would have killed at least 2 of her firefighters. Both trapped residents were recovered. Her team received a unit commendation." He let that settle. "I presented that commendation personally. I have not forgotten it." The room was completely still. "I am telling you this," he said, with a quiet precision that cut the silence cleanly, "because I arrived tonight and found Lieutenant Calloway seated beside the kitchen exit at the far end of the room, at a table where she could neither see nor be seen. And I've been in service long enough to know that where a family seats their daughter says something about what they think she is worth." A sound moved through the guests, not quite a gasp, not quite silence, something between the two. My father had gone very still at the head table. I could see it in my peripheral vision, the way his body had changed from relaxed to rigid, his hand resting flat on the tablecloth. "Rachel Calloway runs into fires," the commissioner said. "She has made life or death decisions with incomplete information in the dark, with heat pressing against her gear and her crew depending on her judgment. She has done this year after year, without recognition from this room, without the acknowledgement she has earned." His voice did not rise. It only deepened. "That ends tonight, as far as I'm concerned." He raised his glass. "To Lieutenant Rachel Calloway, who deserves a seat at the front of any room she walks into." The response was not polite. It was real. Chairs scraped as people stood. Applause built. Beside me, the woman from the nonprofit pressed her hand to her chest. Across the room, someone I didn't know began clapping with the sustained energy of someone who had decided this was important. I sat very still, something hot and difficult pressing behind my eyes. I had spent so many years learning to be unseen in rooms where I should have mattered, that being seen, suddenly, completely, in front of 300 people who had spent the evening not thinking about me, felt almost too large to absorb. The commissioner sat down and said nothing more. He didn't need to. My mother was holding her napkin to her mouth. Tyler was watching me with an expression I had never seen him wear before. Not jealousy, something closer to a reckoning. Like a man who had just been shown a map and realized he had the distances badly wrong. My father was looking at his hands. The evening continued around us. Music resumed. People circulated. Guest after guest found a reason to pass by our table, to shake the commissioner's hand, and every time, without exception, he redirected the introduction to me. He told the story of the Linwood fire to anyone who stood still long enough to hear it. He did not exaggerate. He did not editorialize. He simply said what was true, and what was true was sufficient. At some point in the second hour, I felt the particular shift in the room's air that I had learned to recognize as a child. The approach of my father. He appeared at the edge of the table. Tyler was with him, a step behind, but my father held up a hand slightly and Tyler stopped. My father looked at the commissioner and said carefully, "Douglas, could I steal a few minutes with my daughter?" The commissioner looked at me, the same checking gesture as before, not permission seeking from my father, but consent seeking from me. I gave a small nod. He rose, excused himself with graciousness, and moved toward another cluster of guests. My father pulled out the vacant chair and sat down. For a moment he said nothing. He was a man who had always been most comfortable speaking inside structures he controlled, the meeting room, the dinner table, the vehicle, the job site. Here, in the middle of his own anniversary gala with the evidence of what he had done sitting directly across from him, the structures had been removed. "I didn't seat you there myself," he said. "Your mother handled the arrangements." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "But I knew about it. I saw the chart last week." I held his gaze and said nothing. He exhaled through his nose slowly. "I told myself it didn't matter, that you wouldn't care about where you were sitting, that you were never much for crowds or ceremony." "You were describing yourself," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended, not accusing, just accurate. He looked down at the tablecloth. His hands, which had built things with concrete and timber in long, careful years, rested open on the linen. "I didn't understand what you were doing," he said. "I'm not sure I tried very hard to." "No," I agreed. "You didn't. I thought you chose the fire department because you were running from something. I chose it because I found something," I said. "There's a difference." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." I saw it when he stood up. He glanced toward where the commissioner had gone. "I've known Douglas Merritt for 12 years. He is not a man who says things he doesn't mean." A pause. "And he said quite a lot." "He told the truth," I said. "Yes." My father's voice was quieter now, stripped of its professional register, just a man at a table. "And I should have been the one saying it, years ago." He looked at me with a directness that felt new, not manufactured or performed, just honest and uncomfortable and overdue. "I made you invisible in this family. Not on purpose, but I did it. And I'm sorry, Rachel." It was such a plain sentence. Not ornamented, not qualified. I had spent so many years waiting for a version of it that I had gradually stopped believing it would come, and now that it was here, it sat in my chest like something I didn't know how to hold yet. "I'm not easy," I said after a moment. "I know that. I don't fit your blueprint?" "No," he said, and something shifted in his expression, something almost like pride that hadn't found its right shape yet. "You built your own." Tyler came over after my father left, moving the way he moved when he was uncertain, which was rarely. He sat down, looked at his hands briefly, and said, "I should have pushed back on the seating. You knew." "I saw the chart. I didn't think it was." He stopped. "I told myself it wasn't a big deal." "It was," I said, not unkindly. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. I've taken up a lot of air in this family. I didn't think about what that cost you." Tyler and I had never been combatants, but we had not been allies either. Something shifted in the quiet between us, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The kind of shift that takes a long time to name. "I want to know more about what you do," he said. "I mean that, not just stay safe and move on. I want to actually know." "Okay," I said. "Then ask me," he asked. For the first time in 31 years, my brother asked me about my work and listened to the full answer. The gala ended the way events always end. Slowly, in stages, music softer, guests thinner, coats retrieved from the cloakroom, promises to stay in touch exchanged with varying degrees of sincerity. The commissioner found me near the exit, already in my coat, and shook my hand one last time. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," he replied. "I wanted to." He paused. "In 40 years of service, I have learned exactly one thing worth passing on. People who do the real work have a habit of making themselves smaller so that other people are more comfortable." "Stop doing that." I looked at him. "I'm working on it." He smiled for the first time all evening, small and genuine. "You'll get there." Driving home that night, the city lights moving past my windows, I thought about what it means to be known. Not celebrated, not decorated, not fussed over. Just known, seen for the actual shape of your life and not the idea someone else built around you. I had been fortunate enough to have that in my station, among the crew at Nines, in the people who had stood beside me in smoke and pressure and heat, but I had not had it at home, not for a long time. And I had made my peace with that the way you make peace with a scar, not by pretending it isn't there, but by learning to live alongside it. That night something changed. Not completely, not all at once. But the ground shifted. The weeks after were careful and slow, the way all genuine things are. My father called on a Tuesday evening, not for a special occasion, just to call. He asked about my shift. He asked follow-up questions. He did not redirect the conversation to Tyler's latest project. I sat in my kitchen and talked to him for 45 minutes, and afterward felt something in my rib cage loosen that I hadn't realized was still held tight. My mother moved more carefully. She stayed warm, but the shape of her warmth changed. Less performing, more present. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, and asked questions she had never asked before, about the job, about what I loved about it, about what was hard. It wasn't perfect. Some old patterns surfaced and had to be quietly noted and set aside. But she was trying, and trying from a person who had spent years not trying is not a small thing. Tyler and I started a habit of calling on Sunday mornings. He was genuinely curious. I taught him things about structural fire behavior, and he told me things about load-bearing calculations, and somewhere in the middle of those conversations we discovered we had more common language than either of us had expected. We were both people who built things. We had just been building in different directions. Commissioner Merritt and I kept in touch the way people in the same field keep in touch, not constantly but reliably. He had a way of checking in at exactly the right intervals, asking the right questions, and then getting out of the way. He did not try to mentor me beyond what I wanted. He simply made himself available, which turned out to be the most useful thing he could have done. There was one afternoon, about 3 months after the gala, when I was at my parents' house for a Sunday dinner. A regular Sunday dinner, not an event, not a performance, just a meal, and my father said something I did not expect. We were in the backyard, the early spring air still cold enough to need a jacket, and he was showing me a repair he had made to the back fence. He ran his hand along the post and said, almost to himself, "I didn't know how to raise someone like you." I kept looking for the script. I watched him. He was older than I usually let myself see. His hands were slower. "I gave up on the script a long time ago," I said. "I know." He looked at me sideways. "You were better off for it." He meant it. I could tell he meant it because it cost him something to say it. A man who had spent his whole life believing in the power of the planned structure, admitting that the thing he hadn't planned for had turned out to be worth planning around. We didn't become different people overnight. No family does, but we became more honest ones. And honesty, I have learned, is the load-bearing structure underneath everything else. Take it away and the whole thing eventually comes down. Restore it and the rest can be rebuilt. I still work at Station 9. I still run into the things everyone else runs out of. I come home exhausted in the particular way the job demands, and I make coffee, and I sit with what the shift gave me before I let it go. On quiet mornings, I sometimes think about that ballroom, that folding chair by the kitchen door, the 4 minutes between each swing of the service exit. I think about the moment a man I respected crossed the room and sat down next to me, not out of pity, not out of performance, but because he had been paying attention when no one else was, and he had decided that what he saw deserved to be said out loud. Sometimes the world won't adjust itself until someone speaks first. Sometimes that someone is you, but if you are lucky, if you have done the work and kept faith with it through the years when no one was watching, sometimes it's someone who watched when they didn't have to and remembered when it would have been easy to forget. That is the thing about genuine work. It leaves a record, not always where you expected, not always in the forms you hoped for, but it leaves one. Stand in rooms where you belong. Take up the space you have earned. And don't let anybody fold your name and put it in their pocket unless they're putting it somewhere better. If this story moved something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever felt overlooked in a room where you deserve to be seen, you're not alone, and you're exactly who this channel is for.